Elias Thorne came to the coast to let the sea swallow the noise. He had lived for 2 decades with a roar in his ears, the ghost sound of rotors and shouting, and an ocean that took more than it was owed. The city had only amplified it, its sirens and traffic a pale, insulting echo of the chaos he carried inside. So he had traded the concrete canyons for granite cliffs and the press of crowds for the patient, heavy push of the wind. He sought a silence so profound it would starve the memories. His cabin was a small, defiant box of timber perched on a headland that stared down the throat of the North Atlantic. It was spare, disciplined. A single bed, a wood stove, a table he had built himself. Everything had a purpose, a place. It was the only way he knew how to live, to impose a fragile order on a world that had long ago proven its allegiance to chaos. His days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the tide. He ran the cliff trails before dawn, his breath pluming in the cold, salt-laced air. He spent the afternoons maintaining his gear, mending nets he never used for fishing, and staring at the horizon until the gray of the sea bled into the gray of the sky. He was a man in his mid-40s, but the geography of his face was older, mapped with lines carved not by laughter, but by vigilance. He was tall and lean, built of the dense functional muscle that comes from a life of carrying weight, both literal and figurative. He moved with a quiet economy that was often mistaken for peace, but it was the stillness of a predator, not the calm of a saint. His uniform was as unchanging as the tides, a worn olive field jacket that had molded to his shoulders, a rotation of plaid flannel shirts, faded cargo pants, and a pair of leather boots whose soles knew the precise location of every sharp rock within a 5-mile radius. On his wrist, he wore a military-issue watch, its face scratched and its ticking a quiet, constant metronome against the howl of his past. His Eberly stock half-track backpack, a relic from another life, was always packed, always ready, a habit he couldn't break. He was not entirely alone. By his side, always, was Loki. The dog was a German shepherd, a veteran like Elias, though his war had been fought in different deserts, sniffing out threats Elias had been sent to eliminate. His muzzle was a distinguished silver gray, and he carried his age with a stoic dignity. He was not a pet. He was a partner. Their communication was a silent language of shared glances, subtle shifts in posture, and a trust forged in the understanding that they were both survivors of a world that no longer had a neat and tidy place for them. Loki did not offer effusive affection. He offered presence, a solid breathing anchor in the relentless tide of Elias's thoughts. He would lie by the wood stove while Elias read, his head on his paws, but his ears would track every creak of the cabin, every shift in the wind's direction. He was never entirely off duty. It was Loki who first sensed the anomaly. They were on their evening patrol, a ritual that took them along the spine of the western cliffs. The sun was a smear of bruised orange behind a bank of low, fast-moving clouds. The sea below was a turmoil of slate gray and churning white, relentlessly attacking the base of the cliffs. It was a normal evening, the same as 100 before it. But then Loki stopped. He did not break suddenly. It was a fluid halt, a cessation of movement so deliberate it was more arresting than a bark. He stood with his head lowered slightly, his body rigid, his ears canted forward. His gaze was fixed not on the horizon or on the trail ahead, but down, into the churning chaos of a narrow inlet that cut deep into the cliff face. It was a place the locals called the Maw, a treacherous bottleneck where the tide became a violent, unpredictable force. Elias stopped beside him, his hand resting instinctively on the dog's neck. The fur was tense, the muscle beneath it hard as stone. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble, swallowed by the wind. Loki didn't move. He just stared. His breathing was even, controlled, but his focus was absolute. It was the same posture he had taken a lifetime ago when he had alerted on a hidden pressure plate, a subtle disturbance in the packed earth that had looked like nothing to the human eye. Elias trusted the dog's instincts more than he trusted his own. His senses were dulled by memory, his judgment clouded by ghosts. Loki's were pure. Elias squinted, his eyes scanning the violent water in the maw. He saw nothing but the endless war between water and rock. Foaming eddies, sucking whirlpools, waves that exploded into curtains of spray. There was nothing there. Nothing a man could see. But Loki saw something, or smelled it, or felt it through the vibrations in the granite beneath his paws. A wrongness, a note out of key in the symphony of the storm. Elias made a mental mark, triangulating the spot from a jagged outcrop on the far side of the inlet and a stunted, wind-scoured pine that clung to the cliff edge near them. He didn't know what the dog had found, but he knew it was there, and he knew he would be back. The mountain held its breath, and for a moment, so did he. 3 days passed. A late autumn storm, a furious, shrieking thing, threw itself at the coast. Elias and Loki stayed inside, the cabin groaning under the assault of the wind. The rain came in horizontal sheets, and the world beyond the windows was a blur of gray. Elias fed the fire, cleaned his folding knife until the blade gleamed, and tried not to listen to the other storm, the one that raged in the quiet spaces of his mind. It was always a storm. Always the sting of salt spray, the scream of engines, the weight of a hand slipping from his grasp. He pushed it down, as always, focusing on the solid, reassuring presence of Loki sleeping by the hearth. The dog was his tether to the now, the only thing that kept him from being swept away completely. The morning after the storm broke was unnaturally serene. The world seemed washed clean, stripped down to its essential elements. The sky was a pale, fragile blue, and the air was so clear it felt like looking through a lens. The sea, exhausted, was a sheet of dark, polished glass. The water level in the maw was lower than Elias had ever seen it, and the usual churning violence was replaced by a slow, almost lazy swirl. It was the calm that had been owed. They returned to the spot on the cliff. Loki needed no prompting. He trotted ahead, his gait purposeful, and sat precisely where he had stopped before. He looked down, then back at Elias, a clear and direct question in his intelligent eyes. He let out a low whine, a sound so rare it startled Elias. It was a sound of insistence, of urgency. He then nudged his head toward the cliff edge, a gesture as clear as a pointed finger. Elias lay on his stomach, the damp rock cold against his jacket, and peered over the edge. The water in the inlet was a deep, translucent emerald. The storm had scoured it, pulling back the curtain of silt and foam. And now he could see it. It was deep, at least 40 feet down, but the clarity of the water made it seem close enough to touch. A shape. A dark, angular, unnatural shape wedged between the sheer underwater walls of the inlet. It was not rock. Rock was worn and rounded by the sea. This had lines. It had angles. It had intention. It was a tomb of metal, held fast in the stone jaws of the maw. He knew immediately he had to go down. The thought was not a choice. It was an imperative. The mystery of it was a hook, pulling him out of the stagnant waters of his own solitude. He went back to the cabin, his mind, for the first time in a long time, focused on a problem that was not his own. He retrieved his climbing harness and ropes, gear he hadn't used in years but had maintained with the same unconscious discipline he applied to everything. He also gathered a small, rudimentary dive kit, a mask, fins, and a small pony bottle of air he kept for emergencies. It wouldn't give him much time, but it would be enough for a first look. Securing the rope to a thick, gnarled root that had become part of the cliff itself, he rappelled down the sheer rock face. Loki watched from above, a silent, unmoving sentinel. The descent was slow, methodical. His hands and feet found holds with an old, familiar muscle memory. He landed on a narrow, slick ledge of rock just a few feet above the water's surface. From this angle, the shape was clearer. It was the stern and part of the superstructure of a boat. Small, but built for speed and stealth, its lines sharp and aggressive even in its watery grave. He pulled on the mask, took a few deep, calming breaths from the regulator, and slipped into the shocking cold of the water. The cold was a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs, but he forced himself to relax, to acclimate. He kicked down, following the sheer wall of the cliff into the green twilight. The silence was immediate and absolute. The roar of the wind was gone, replaced by the sound of his own breathing, loud and rhythmic in his ears. The boat was wedged tight, its bow crumpled where it had met the far wall of the inlet. It was a military craft, but not one he recognized from his time in the service. It was older, perhaps from the 80s or early 90s, but it had a futuristic, experimental look to it. Its hull was coated in a material that seemed to absorb the light, making it difficult to focus on. It was designed not to be seen. He swam closer, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid kicking up silt. The main hatch was sealed, but a smaller access port on the side was slightly ajar, bent outward as if from an internal explosion or a desperate attempt to get out. He could see no signs of life, no human remains, just the eerie, silent interior filled with water and floating debris. It wasn't a simple crash. There was a story here, a violent, final chapter played out in the dark. As he circled the wreck, something caught his eye. A glint of metal, half buried in the sand and gravel at the base of the cliff, a few yards from the boat. The storm's violent scouring of the seabed must have uncovered it. He swam over and brushed away the sand. It was a box. A hard-sided, watertight case, no bigger than a briefcase, with military-style latches. It was heavy, solid. He worked his fingers under it, leveraging it out of the sand. Its weight was reassuring. A solid piece of evidence in a place of ghosts. With his air running low, he tucked the case under his arm and began his slow ascent, leaving the dark shape of the boat to its silent vigil in the deep. Breaking the surface, he took a deep, shuddering breath of the cold, clean air and looked up. Loki was still there, watching, waiting. He had known. The case was a piece of his old life dropped into his new one. The latches were standard military grade, but the lock in the center was a high-security pin tumbler system he recognized. It was designed to be opened only by a specific key, or by someone who knew its internal mechanics intimately. He carried it back to the cabin, the weight of it a tangible question in his hand. He set it on his workbench, the metal cold and slick with seawater. Loki came over and sniffed it once, then looked at Elias and gave a low, quiet huff, as if to say, "Well, get on with it." Elias knew he could likely force it, but that risked destroying whatever was inside. The answer, if there was one, lay in patience and information. Before attempting to open the box, he needed context. A boat like that, lost in a place like this, should have left a paper trail, an incident report, a news article, a local legend. Something. The nearest town was a 30-mile drive along a winding coastal road. It was a small, hardy community that had made its living from the sea for generations and was now slowly succumbing to the tourist trade. The county records office was housed in a stately old stone building that smelled of old paper, floor wax, and damp wool. Behind a high wooden counter sat a woman who seemed as much a fixture of the place as the building itself. She was in her late 50s, tall and spare, with intelligent, cautious eyes and graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. A small engraved plaque on the counter read, "Evelyn Reed, County Clerk." Elias approached the counter. He was an outsider, and he felt the weight of her professional curiosity. Men like him, who lived alone on the headlands, usually wanted to be left alone. They didn't come to town asking questions. "I'm looking for maritime records," he began, his voice quiet, unused to conversation. "Accident reports, salvage logs, anything you might have for the coastline north of here, specifically the area around the inlet known as the Maw." Evelyn Reed looked at him over the top of her spectacles. Her gaze was level, appraising. "That's a bad stretch of water. Has been for 100 years. Nobody with any sense takes a boat in there. What's your interest?" "I found something," Elias said, offering no more. She seemed to weigh his words, his posture, the quiet intensity in his eyes. She recognized something in him, perhaps. The discipline, the lack of wasted words. She was a woman who dealt in facts, in the black and white of recorded history, and she seemed to decide he was a man who respected them. "I can look," she said, turning to a wall of heavy, leather-bound ledgers. "But I can tell you now, I've lived here my whole life. I've processed every birth, death, and deed in this county for 30 years. I've never seen an official report of a wreck in the Maw. Plenty of boats have gone missing near it, but none in it. The currents would have torn anything apart and spit it out to sea." She spent 20 minutes pulling down dusty volumes, her fingers tracing lines of faded ink. She checked shipwreck manifests from the last century, Coast Guard reports, even old insurance claims. There was nothing. No record of a lost vessel, military or civilian, in that specific location. It was a blank space on the map, a historical void. The boat at the bottom of the inlet did not officially exist. "Told you," she said, closing the last ledger with a soft thud. "It's a ghost. Or you're mistaken." She looked at him, and he knew she didn't believe the latter. "If there's anyone who might know something that isn't in these books, it's Eris Thorne. He's a retired oceanographer, lives over on the old lighthouse road. Knows more about what the sea has swallowed around here than the sea itself. He's a bit of an eccentric, but his memory is a library." She wrote an address on a slip of paper and pushed it across the counter. "Tell him I sent you. It might help." Elias thanked her and left. The lack of a record was more telling than a detailed report. It meant the boat's disappearance was not an accident that had been investigated. It was an event that had been deliberately erased. Back at the cabin, the locked case sat waiting. He now understood that whatever was inside was a secret, meant to stay that way. He studied the lock again. He had spent a portion of his training learning to defeat systems exactly like this. It required patience, a delicate touch, and an understanding of how things were built. He gathered a small set of tools, a tension wrench, and a series of fine steel picks. He sat at the table, the only light from a single lamp that threw his focused shadow against the wall. Loki lay at his feet, his chin on his paws, watching. The work was meditative. It was about feeling, not force. He inserted the tension wrench, applying the slightest rotational pressure. Then, with a pick, he began to probe the inside of the lock, feeling for the pins. One by one, he located them, gently nudging each one up to its shear line. It was a conversation in metal, a quiet, intricate dance of millimeters. The first pin set with a faint click, a sound only he could feel through the steel. Then the second, the third. He worked for nearly an hour. The only sound, the whisper of the wind outside, and the soft clicks of the tumblers. Finally, with the last pin set, the core of the lock gave way with a satisfying snap. The mechanism was defeated. He paused, his hand resting on the lid. The moment felt heavy, a threshold. He opened it. There was no gold, no weapons, no treasure. It was filled with records. On top lay a thick, leather-bound logbook, its pages protected by a waterproof sleeve. Beneath it was a small metal reel of magnetic audio tape, the kind used for old-school data or voice recording. And at the bottom was a bundle of photographs wrapped in oilcloth. He opened the logbook first. The handwriting was small, neat, and precise. It was a scientific journal. The entries were dated from the fall of 1989. They detailed a series of cognitive and physiological enhancement trials conducted aboard a vessel designated Project Chimera. The entries described the administration of a complex biochemical agent designated BCX7 to a group of 5 subjects. The early entries were clinical, detached, filled with data on heart rate, neural activity, and improved reaction times. The subjects were performing beyond all projected parameters. Then the tone began to change. A week into the trials, the lead scientist noted minor dissociative episodes in one subject. 2 days later, auditory hallucinations were reported by 2 more. The neat handwriting grew slightly less controlled. The entries became more frequent, more frantic. The scientist wrote of escalating paranoia among the subjects, of violent outbursts, of a complete breakdown of cohesion. The wonder of the initial results had curdled into fear. The final entry was a scrawl, barely legible. BCX7 unstable. Cascade failure. Subjects compromised. Director Vance ordered full sanitization protocol. God forgive us, they were good men. Below the entry was a list of 5 names. Elias read the list, his blood turning to ice. The 4th name on the list was Commander Michael Rourke, a man Elias had known, a man who had been his mentor in the early days of his training. The official story was that Rourke and his team had been lost in a helicopter crash during a deep-water training exercise off the coast of Virginia. A tragic accident. A lie. He picked up the photographs. They showed 5 young men, lean and confident, in black tactical gear, standing on the deck of a sleek, dark boat, the same boat now wedged in the maw. He recognized a younger, smiling Michael Rourke immediately. They weren't just subjects, they were soldiers, operators, and they had been sacrificed for a secret. Armed with a name, Project Chimera, and a company, the log mentioned a Director Vance from the Ethelred Group. Elias drove to the address Evelyn Reed had given him. The old lighthouse road was a narrow track that ended at a whitewashed cottage battered by wind and time. Dr. Eris Thorne was a man who seemed to be made of the same stuff as the coast itself, weathered, craggy, and with eyes as pale and clear as a winter sky. Elias didn't show him the logbook. He simply showed him a detailed sketch he had made of the submersible. Thorne's eyes, usually lost in a haze of academic contemplation, sharpened with an almost boyish excitement. "My God," he breathed, taking the drawing. "I've only ever seen blueprints of this. This is the Nereus, a deep-water stealth prototype. Ethelred Defense Systems built 2 of them in the late 80s, a private contract. The hull was made of a non-ferrous composite, a ceramic matrix. It was designed to be virtually invisible to sonar and magnetic anomaly detectors. A ghost ship." "What happened to them?" Elias asked. "The official story?" Thorne said with a wry smile. "The one they fed to the public and the Pentagon oversight committees? Unit 1 developed a catastrophic flaw in its power plant during sea trials and was lost with all hands. A tragic but necessary cost of innovation. The project was deemed too unstable, and it was scrapped. Unit 2 was dismantled. Ethelred was paid a hefty insurance settlement and a cancellation fee, and the whole thing was buried under a mountain of classified paperwork." He tapped the drawing. "They said it was lost in the deep ocean, 1,000 miles from anywhere. They never specified a location. To find it here, in a coastal inlet. He looked at Elias, the excitement in his eyes replaced by a dawning, somber understanding. That wasn't an accident, was it? That was a dumping ground. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of cold, corporate murder. A failed experiment. A group of men deemed expendable. A cover-up so thorough it had held for over 30 years. Until a dog with graying fur had decided something was wrong. When Elias returned to his cabin, the sun was low, painting the undersides of the clouds in shades of blood and rust. He felt the familiar weight of the world settling on his shoulders, but this time it was different. It wasn't the formless dread of his own past. It was the solid, specific gravity of a new responsibility. These men deserved their story to be told. Michael Rourke deserved his name cleared. Parked in the clearing beside his cabin was a pristine black SUV. It was so clean, so out of place in the rugged landscape, that it looked like a tear in the fabric of reality. Leaning against its fender, as if he had been waiting for hours, was a man. He was in his late 40s or early 50s, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and shoes that had never touched dirt. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed. He radiated an aura of calm, expensive authority. As Elias got out of his truck, the man pushed himself off the fender and walked forward, his hand extended. "Mr. Thorne? Elias Thorne?" he asked, his voice smooth and modulated, the kind of voice used to soothe shareholders and dismiss inconvenient questions. "My name is Julian Vance. I'm with the Aethelred Group, Archival and Risk Mitigation." Elias ignored the outstretched hand. He looked at the name. Vance. The same name as the director from the logbook. A son? A nephew? A legacy. Loki, who had been sitting in the passenger seat, let out a low rumble, a sound that was barely audible but vibrated with menace. "I believe you found something that belongs to us," Vance continued, his smile not faltering as he withdrew his hand. "An old piece of corporate property. We've been monitoring the site for some time, remotely. Submersible drones. The geological instability of the inlet has always made a direct recovery impossible. The recent storm, however, seems to have shifted things. It also damaged our primary monitoring buoy, which is why we didn't know the wreck had become accessible, until one of our long-range sensors picked up unauthorized hard-suit diving activity in the area." He gave a small, knowing smile. "That would be you." "It's a grave site," Elias said, his voice flat. Vance's expression became one of practiced sympathy. "Indeed, a tragic accident from long ago. The men on that vessel were pioneers, heroes. Their families were compensated, their sacrifice honored. The technology, however, remains highly sensitive. Its recovery is a matter of corporate, and I dare say national security. We are prepared to offer you a very generous finder's fee, a consultancy payment, for your silence and discretion while our team conducts a sensitive reclamation." The words were carefully chosen, bureaucratic, designed to strip the situation of all moral weight. Reclamation, not desecration. Elias stood there for a long moment, the wind whipping his jacket around him. He looked at this polished man, this inheritor of a 30-year-old crime, and felt a cold, clear certainty settle in his soul. He had run from his own failure, his own moral compromise, for years. He had chosen solitude because he felt he no longer had the right to stand for anything. But this man, and the secret he guarded, had inadvertently given him a chance to find that right again. Without a word, Elias turned and walked into his cabin. Vance watched him, a flicker of irritation crossing his smooth features. Elias went to his table, picked up the small, portable cassette player he kept for listening to old mission debriefs, and slotted in the magnetic tape from the case. He walked back to the doorway and pressed play. The voice that crackled from the small speaker was thin, distorted by time and water damage, but it was unmistakably human, and it was terrified. "Can't sleep. The walls they're breathing. I see things in the corners, shadows. Jim tried to open the hatch last night, said he had to get out, had to get away from the whispering. We had to restrain him. Commander Rourke is trying to hold it together, but I see it in his eyes. He's losing time. He stares at the sonar screen, but he's not seeing it. He's seeing something else. This isn't an enhancement. It's a poison." Vance knew. He had to have known. He called it a cascade failure. He's not sending help. He's sending a cleanup crew. Oh God, the water is so cold. The voice broke off into a sob. Then there was only static. Elias pressed stop. The silence that followed was immense, heavy. Vance's pleasant mask had vanished. His face was a tight, bloodless knot of fury. The polite fiction had been stripped away, leaving only the ugly truth. "That is classified material," Vance hissed, his voice losing its smooth veneer. "Possession of that recording is a federal offense. You are a man with a complicated past, Mr. Thorne. A man who lives off the grid, with no official ties. A man whose service record has redactions. It would be very easy for you to become entangled in legal troubles that would make you disappear for a very long time. Give me the case and everything in it. Walk away. This is your only warning." It was in that moment that Loki acted. He had been sitting at Elias's side, a statue of coiled potential. Now he rose silently to his feet. He took 2 steps forward, placing himself between Elias and Vance. He didn't bark. He didn't snap. He simply lifted his lip on one side, revealing a long, yellow-white canine tooth. It was accompanied by a growl, a low, guttural vibration that seemed to come from the center of the earth. It was not the sound of an angry dog. It was the sound of a weapon being armed. It was a calm, lethal promise. Vance, for all his tailored suits and corporate power, was still an animal who understood predators. He took an involuntary step back, his eyes wide. His composure shattered, replaced by a raw, naked fear. He looked from the dog to Elias's unyielding face, and he understood. This was not a negotiation. He turned, his movement stiff, and got back into his pristine SUV. The engine started with a whisper, and the vehicle pulled away, its tires spitting gravel. The threat, however, did not leave with him. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating, a promise of what was to come. The forecast called for a gale. Not a storm, but a sustained, brutal wind that would churn the sea into a frenzy and claw at the land for a full 24 hours. Elias knew Vance would use it. The noise, the chaos, the reduced visibility, it was the perfect cover. He wouldn't come back to negotiate. He would come back to finish the job his predecessor had started 30 years ago. To erase Project Chimera from existence. Elias spent the rest of the day preparing. He wasn't planning a fight. A physical confrontation with a corporate salvage team was a losing battle. His mission was preservation. He had to retrieve the one piece of evidence that could not be denied, the item mentioned in the logbook's final frantic entry. The vessel's main data recorder. The black box. It would contain the full, unedited logs, telemetry, and likely even cockpit voice recordings from the submersible's final hours. It was the heart of the secret. He packed a small waterproof bag with essentials. The original logbook, the tape, and the photographs. He sent a single, prearranged text message to Evelyn Reed. The message contained only one word. Ethelred. It was the signal they had agreed upon. A simple alarm bell that would, he hoped, bring official eyes to this forgotten corner of the coast. He didn't know if she would act, or if she could act in time, but it was the only outside help he could ask for. As dusk began to settle, bringing with it the first powerful gusts of the gale, he saw it. A light on the horizon. Not the familiar pulsing beam of the distant lighthouse, but the steady industrial lights of a workboat plowing through the building seas, heading directly for the maw. Vance was not wasting any time. The dive would be suicidal. The inlet, dangerous on a calm day, would become a liquid vortex in the storm surge. But it was the only chance. The salvage team would likely use cutting torches or explosives to destroy the wreck, to make it unsalvageable and unidentifiable. He had to get the recorder before they could begin. He put on his dry suit, the familiar rubbery scent a small comfort. He gathered his dive gear, this time with a larger air tank. Loki watched his every move, his brown eyes filled with an anxious intelligence. He knew. The dog whined softly, pressing his head against Elias's leg. "I'll be back," Elias said, resting his hand on the dog's head. It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. He and Loki made their way to the cliff edge just as the workboat was maneuvering into the mouth of the inlet. It was a powerful, ugly vessel with a heavy-duty crane mounted on its deck. Two smaller inflatable boats were being lowered into the water, manned by figures in black rain gear. They were professionals. Elias began setting up his rappel line. He had to get down to the water's edge, and fast. As he worked, two of Vance's men appeared in the cliff top, having approached from the landward side. One was a large, brutish man. The other was younger, with the unmistakable bearing of a former soldier. This must be Marcus. He moved with a practiced efficiency, but his eyes were uneasy. "That's far enough," the big man grunted. He was holding a long, heavy wrench. "Mr. Vance wants you to stay up here. Enjoy the view." Elias ignored him, his focus on securing his anchor. He had one chance, one window. The standoff was a distraction he couldn't afford. The wind howled, tearing at them, trying to peel them from the rock. Below, a huge swell surged into the maw, the water rising and falling a terrifying 20 feet with each wave. It was then that Loki moved. He didn't charge. He flowed forward, a dark shape in the gloom, and placed himself directly in front of the younger man, Marcus. He didn't growl, didn't show his teeth. He just stood there, a silent, immovable barrier. His message was clear. You will not pass. The scene froze for a heartbeat, a tableau against the raging storm. Elias finishing his knot, the brutish man taking a step forward, Marcus staring down at the unflinching dog. And then chaos. A monstrous wave, bigger than the rest, crashed into the base of the cliff not far from them. The impact was titanic, a sound like a mountain breaking. The ground shuddered, and a shower of spray and loose rock erupted upwards. A piece of granite, the size of a fist, spun through the air and struck Loki high on his hind leg. The dog yelped, a sharp cry of pain that cut through the wind's roar. He stumbled, his leg buckling, but he did not fall. He stayed on his feet, planting his 3 good legs, his eyes still fixed on Marcus. He whimpered, a low, painful sound, but he did not abandon his post. Elias saw it all. He saw the rock hit, he heard the cry of pain, and in that instant, the gale around him vanished. He was somewhere else. He was on the deck of a speeding boat in another storm, 20 years ago. The air was filled with rotor wash and shouting. A man, his friend, was slipping from the rescue ladder. The commander was yelling, "We have to go! The mission is compromised! Let him go, Thorn!" And he had. He had let go. He had chosen the mission. He had followed the order. He had lived with the ghost of that choice, the phantom weight of that hand, every day since. He looked from the raging water below, where the data recorder, the mission, was waiting, to his dog. his partner, bleeding and in pain, but holding the line for him. The choice was the same: the mission or the man at his side. The ghosts of the past screamed at him, demanding a different outcome. He let go of the rope. He turned his back on the sea, on the wreck, on the 30-year-old secret. He walked calmly over to Loki, knelt in the wet grass, and gently touched the dog's injured leg. The bone was broken. He looked up, his gaze cutting through the wind and the rain, and met the eyes of the conflicted soldier Marcus. Then he looked past him, to where he knew Vance was watching from the workboat. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried the force of an oath. It's over. He had made a different choice. He chose loyalty. He chose to stay. In that moment of surrender, he felt a profound and unexpected sense of release, as if a weight he had been carrying for 2 decades had finally been set down. The act was a quiet one, but its impact was seismic. Marcus, the ex-soldier, saw it all. He saw the hardened veteran turn his back on the objective to tend to his wounded partner. He saw an act of loyalty that transcended any mission parameter or paycheck. It was a choice he understood in his bones. He lowered the heavy pry bar he was holding, letting it clatter to the rock. He looked at his brutish companion, then out toward the boat where Vance was undoubtedly watching, and he shook his head. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not a part of this." At that exact moment, headlights cut through the gloom and rain. 2 vehicles were bumping down the track toward them: the county sheriff's truck and Evelyn Reed's old sedan. Evelyn, true to her word, had not hesitated. The single word Ethelred had been enough. She had taken the 30 years of blank pages in her record books as a personal affront, a crime of omission she was now determined to correct. The arrival of official authority, of witnesses, was the final blow to Vance's clandestine operation. The tide had turned. From the deck of the workboat, Vance must have seen it all through his binoculars. The injured dog, Elias's surrender, his own man's defiance, and the arrival of the law. His plan, built on secrecy and intimidation, had evaporated into the storm. The advantage was lost. A quiet act of moral courage, amplified by the integrity of a small-town clerk and the conscience of a single hired hand, had unraveled a conspiracy 30 years in the making. The secret of the maw was no longer his to control. It now belonged to the light. The morning after the gale was born of an impossible quiet. The wind had scrubbed the sky to a clean, pale canvas, and the sea, exhausted, lay flat and passive. The workboat was gone. In its place, anchored just outside the inlet, was a state-owned vessel from the Maritime Forensics Unit. The black SUV was also gone, but the sheriff's truck remained, a quiet symbol of a shift in power. Elias sat on the steps of his cabin porch, the early sun warm on his face. Beside him, Loki lay sleeping, his injured leg cleaned, splinted, and carefully bandaged. The local vet had come out at dawn, a favor to the sheriff, and confirmed a clean break of the fibula. He would heal. He would walk again, maybe with a limp, a physical reminder of the night the ghosts had been faced down. Evelyn Reed stood by the railing, a mug of coffee in her hand. She had stayed through the night, a silent, formidable presence ensuring everything was done by the book. Vance and his crew had been escorted back to the mainland by the sheriff for questioning. The contents of Elias's waterproof bag, the logbook, the tape, the photos, were now official evidence, logged and sealed. "Dr. Thorne has been busy," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. "He made a call last night to a journalist he knows at the Boston Globe, a man who specializes in old defense contract scandals. The story is already in motion. Athelred Group will have to answer for this, publicly. She took a sip of her coffee. You did the right thing, Mr. Thorne. Elias didn't answer. He just ran his hand along Loki's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The right thing. It was a simple phrase for such a complicated journey. A car was making its way up the long drive to the cabin. Not a police vehicle. It was a small, unassuming rental car. It parked, and a woman got out. She was younger than him, with the same dark hair and a face that held a shadow of his own. His sister, Sarah. He hadn't seen her in 5 years. He hadn't spoken to her in 2. After the storm had broken, in the dead quiet of the pre-dawn hours, he had called her. He hadn't known what to say, so he had just told her where he was. And she had come. Their reunion was not one of dramatic tears or long speeches. It was as quiet and understated as they were. She walked up onto the porch, looked at Loki, then at him. You look tired, she said. You too, he replied. She smiled, a small, sad, beautiful thing. I missed you, Eli. I know, he said. And for the first time he felt the truth of it not as an accusation, but as a bridge. He had spent years building walls to keep the world out, to keep his own failures contained. Now, one by one, they were starting to come down. He looked past his sister, at his own faint reflection in the cabin window. For years he had avoided his own gaze. He had seen only the man who had let go, the man who had failed. Now he saw something else. He saw the man who had stayed, the man who had chosen his partner. He held his own gaze, and he did not look away. In the weeks that followed, the story of Project Chimera unfolded. The submersible was carefully raised from the maw, its data recorder intact. The story it told was even more damning than the handwritten log. It was a cold, clinical record of corporate ambition overriding human decency, of 5 good soldiers sacrificed on the altar of progress and profit. The Athelred Group was engulfed in a firestorm of legal and public relations disasters. The names of the 5 men, including Michael Rourke, were officially cleared, their true fate acknowledged. The site of the wreck, the inlet known as the Maw, was designated a protected historical grave, a permanent memorial to the men who had been lost there. Elias did not leave the coast. The silence he had come for was no longer an escape, but a comfort. The noise in his head had quieted, replaced by the rhythm of the tides and the steady beat of his own heart. One afternoon, Evelyn Reed and the sheriff came to his cabin. They had a proposition. The county's volunteer search and rescue team was small, underfunded, but dedicated. They needed a leader, someone with his skills, someone who knew the cliffs and the water, someone who knew how to find what was lost. He looked at Loki, whose limp was already improving and who was watching him with those same knowing eyes. He accepted. It was a new mission, not of destruction, but of preservation, a way to use the skills of his past to build a future. Months later, the last traces of winter had surrendered to a stubborn spring. The cliffs were dotted with green, and the air held a hint of warmth. Elias stood on the high ridge, the same spot where it had all begun. Loki was beside him, his gait almost back to normal, his presence a solid, reassuring weight. They looked down into the inlet. The water was a peaceful, shimmering turquoise. The dark shape was gone. The tomb was empty. The secret was out. Elias felt a sense of peace settle over him, a calm as deep and vast as the sea before him. The ghosts were still there. They would always be there. But they no longer screamed. They whispered. And they spoke not of failure, but of a choice remade, of a debt repaid. He had come to this place to outrun his past, to find an ending. Instead, he had found a beginning. He rested his hand on Loki's head, and together the two old soldiers stood their watch, guardians of a quiet coast, at peace in the silence they had earned.